Hey there, Eastown Church. I am so excited to get to be with you today. My name is Stacie Wood, and my husband Andy and I moved to the Bay Area about 13 years ago to help start Echo Church in the Silicon Valley. And so we feel such a partnership and camaraderie with your pastors, Clint and Michael, who moved here to start Eastown Church. And we're just working together in partnership to reach the Bay Area with the good news about Jesus. Now, Clint and Michael have actually become really good friends of ours as well. And recently we went out on a double date together to this random restaurant in Fremont that none of us had ever been to before. And we just lucked out because it happened to be karaoke night at this restaurant. And it was so bizarre and such a weird experience. The DJ actually had a live puppy that sat on his shoulder the whole night. And it was so funny to us. So we love to laugh and have fun with Clint and Michael. We just love your pastors so much. Now, one thing that we do at Eastown every week is we invite you to check in with us. This is such a great way for us to stay connected with you and hear what's going on in your life. And so we've made it really easy for you to do that. All you need to do is text the word Eastown to 94000 and just let us know how you're doing. How can we pray for you? What resources do you need that we can get connected to you so that we can better serve you? Now, the other thing that I wanted to invite you to consider participating in is giving back to God. We at Eastown believe that as we give back to God, we literally get to partner with Him in bringing His kingdom here on earth and in the Bay Area. So when we give back to God, we get to love local. We get to share the good news of Jesus with others. And so we've tried to make it as simple as possible. You can actually just text the word give, GYVE, to the number 313131, and we can partner together to see that happen. Now, I am really excited to be jumping in to this message series called Storyline that we're in the middle of here at Eastown. And I love this concept for a message series because all of us have stories, don't we? Like, you're living a story, I'm living a story. There are stories all throughout the Bible of people's lives, and every single story matters to God. And the thing about our stories is that God is continually teaching us lessons as we live the story of our life. That in whatever season we are in, there are lessons to be learned. And probably all of us are in a slightly different season, right? Some of you are students and you are so excited just to be done with school for the summer. Or if you're taking summer school, I do apologize. I am sorry for you, but the rest of you are really enjoying your summer. Some of you are young professionals and you're just learning this life-work balance and going for it with your careers. Some of you are young parents and you have like no sleep, but you've got a lot of love and hopefully a lot of joy in your home. Some of you are like plowing through the middle years. That's kind of where Andy and I find ourselves. We've got 3 kids, ages 14, 12, and 7. And man, it's just a lot of doing life together. It's a lot of driving our kids to 14 different places a day and just getting through life with each other. And then some of you are probably empty nesters. And wow, that is a new season that for the first time in a long time, you are at home without lots of other people to take care of. And so you're finding your new rhythms. And listen, every season has joy and gifts to be received, and every season has hardship and lessons to be learned. And the thing is that the way God has designed life to work is that each season builds on the season before it. So the way that we are currently living this season, the way that we are responding to life and the hardships and the trials is preparing us for the next season. We don't know what lies right around the corner for us, but God does. And so He's bringing things into this season of life to prepare us for the next season. And the way that we respond to one season determines whether or not we're going to develop the strength that God has for us in this season, or we're going to diminish that strength. So every season requires a different response from us. And so that's what I want to talk about today. We are going to look at the story of a woman in the Bible. Her name is Mary of Bethany, and I love Mary of Bethany. We get to see her 3 different times in Scripture. And so we're going to take a snapshot of each of those moments today. And I'm calling it Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And what we're going to learn from Mary of Bethany's life is that different seasons require a different response. And we can choose to respond to whatever circumstance we're in a way that draws us nearer to God, or in a way that pushes us away from God, that leads us to walk away instead of toward him. And so let's dive into the life of Mary of Bethany and see how she leans into God and into her relationship with him through every season of her life. So Act 1 is the act of her life that I am calling the act of desperation. And in this act, this is the first time that we see Mary of Bethany in the Bible. It's in Luke 10, and we're going to find her sitting at the feet of Jesus. So in Luke 10, verse number 38, it says, "As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister, Mary, sat at the Lord's feet." And that phrase right there, sat at the Lord's feet, is really important. We're going to come back to that. And so she was sitting there listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details. There's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it." Or another translation says, "Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." That phrase, that Mary sat at the Lord's feet, is not merely a phrase just letting us know the location in the room where Mary was. It's actually a phrase that describes an intentional discipleship relationship between Jesus and Mary. You see, in another part of the Bible, it talks about how Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was his instructor, and Paul was the pupil. It was a teaching relationship. And so Mary is intentionally sitting under the teaching of Jesus in this scenario. And it's significant because traditionally in this culture, this never would have happened. Women were not invited into these spaces. Rabbis would not even speak to a woman in public. And so Jesus, he is elevating the status of women in society. He is pushing up against that cultural barrier for women, and he is allowing her to sit there and learn from him. Not only does he allow her to be there, but he defends her choice. He applauds her choice to others. And let's just be really clear that it was a choice. It was a courageous choice. It was like a Rosa Parks kind of choice. Like, I know I'm not really supposed to be here, and I might encounter some opposition by being here, but this is where I need to be. And I am desperate to learn from this man. And so I'm willing to offend you. I'm willing to push up against these barriers because I am desperate to get from him what he wants to teach to me. There was a hunger, a tenacity about her teachability. And I love that about Mary. It's an attitude of, I'm going to do whatever it takes to learn from this man. Have you ever noticed that you and I tend to be a lot more teachable whenever we are in desperate situations? Like when we are in over our head and we have no idea what to do, we start looking for advice from anyone that's willing to give it. We will Google it. We will phone a friend. We're calling our mentors. We're reading pop psychology books. Anywhere we can find some advice, we are desperate to get it. And when we are desperate, we are at our most teachable moments. I want to share with you a story from my own life, a very personal story about a moment in time when I felt incredibly desperate for wisdom. I did not know what to do. And this is a story that revolves around our adoption. So we adopted a little boy named Sammy from Ethiopia when he was just under the age of 2 years old. One of the best moments of my life when we met Sammy and got to bring him home. And let me tell you, when we were there in Ethiopia with Sammy, it was so much fun. He was full of life, full of joy. He was so playful. He was a great eater and a great sleeper and just in a great mood all the time. It was a dream. But something happened when we got on that airplane to bring Sammy home from Ethiopia. It was like a switch flipped in him, and he immediately went into this this traumatized mode. And for the next 18 months, we would be working through this trauma, trying to find some stability in our family. So let me describe a little bit what it was like. Sammy was with me 24 hours a day. I could never leave his sight because he was terrified that perhaps I was gone forever. And so he was normally in my arms, and if he wasn't in my arms, he was at my feet with his arms up. And the funny thing about it was, he wanted to always be held, but he did not want to be touched. It was like this weird attachment thing where he wanted to be near me, but his skin, like he didn't want me to touch him. And at nighttime, it was when it was at its worst. You know, at nighttime, when it was time to go to bed, we would need to stay with him, either Andy or I, until he fell asleep. And he would be laying there, and we'd think he was almost asleep, and he'd pop his head up and make sure we were still there, and then he'd lay back down. And every single night, we'd go through this process. It would take over an hour for him to fall asleep every night, and one of us would need to be by his side. And then all throughout the night, every 2, 3, or 4 hours, Sammy would wake up. And he would just be waking up to make sure we were still there in the room with him. And he would pop his head up, and sometimes he would be really playful and like try to play peekaboo in the middle of the night. Where I'm like, dude, we're not playing peekaboo at 3 a.m. And sometimes he would not be playful. He would be screaming. He would cry himself back to sleep. And, you know, I'm okay with kids crying themselves to sleep. My other 2 kids did that too. But with Sammy, it was different. There was this terror in his scream. It was like he was so miserable in his own skin, and there was nothing I could do to comfort him. He would bury his head in his mattress and push his little body as far up against the side of his pack and play away from me as he could. And he was not soothed by my touch. If I would try to rub his back, it was like he was so uncomfortable in his own skin. He was like trying to crawl out of his own skin. It was a horrible thing to watch your child go through. And I was so lost in that moment at what to do for him. You know, every adoptive family knows that adoption is a beautiful and a redemptive thing, but it's also brutal because no child should be forced to go through that. No child should be forced to lose their biological family or be forced to have to reattach to this new family that looks different and sounds different and smells different. It's such a challenging thing for a child to go through. And Andy and I were exhausted. After 18 months of never having a night's sleep, we were at the end of ourselves. And I remember waking up every morning and sitting there with my Bible on my lap and my journal open and just so desperately saying, Jesus, speak to me. What do you want me to do here? What are you saying to me? How can I love this child? What does he need? And in the quietness of those moments, as I would sit at the feet of Jesus, he would speak to my heart. He would reveal things to me through his word. He would speak to me in my journal as I processed my prayers out loud before him. And he would say, Stacie, this is what love looks like on days when love is hard to come by. You see, some of you are right there in the middle of it right now. You are facing a decision. It's a moment in time. Your back is against the wall, and you are desperate for wisdom. And I want you to know that Jesus is available to offer that to you. And so my question for you today is, whose feet are you going to sit at? Are you going to Google all the answers? Are you going to phone a friend or reach out to mentors or read all the psychology books? And let me tell you, there is nothing wrong with those things. You should do all those things. There's something to be gained from all of those things. But just like with Mary, there is one thing that is better. There is one thing that we cannot ignore. There is a priority, a precedent that must take place, that I will sit at the feet of Jesus because his wisdom is timeless and it is available for every situation in our lives. So will you sit at the feet of Jesus today? Will you allow your desperation to lead you to dependence on God? That's Act 1 of Mary's life. Now, Act 2 is what I call the act of grief. And the second time that we are going to see Mary It's right after her brother Lazarus has died. And the sisters, Mary and Martha, had sent word to Jesus that their brother was sick. And what you need to know is that Mary and Martha and Lazarus, they were not just casual acquaintances of Jesus. They were his friends. The Bible refers to them as people that Jesus loved. And so when they sent word to him that Lazarus was sick, they fully expected that he would come and heal him, just as he had healed so many other people before. But Jesus didn't come, and Lazarus died. And so those two sisters were left not just in really deep grief, but also incredibly confused and hurt. Like they knew that Jesus could have done something about this, and yet he didn't. He was only a few miles away. He had the complete ability to have shown up, and yet for whatever reason, he chose not to. Let me tell you, that is a deep and soul-shaking place to be. Like if you have ever been in a place where you had a critical need and you asked God to come through on your behalf and you knew full well that he was capable of it, and yet for whatever reason, he chose not to. That's hard. Have you ever been there? Because I know I have. And that is the devastation that Mary is experiencing as Jesus finally shows up 4 days after they have put Lazarus in the tomb. And she's thinking to herself, Lord, what happened? What was I supposed to do with this? And this time we're not going to find Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. We're going to find her falling at his feet. So it picks up and says that Martha returned to Mary, and she called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher's here and he wants to see you. So Mary immediately went to him. When Mary arrived, she saw Jesus and she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. I love that Mary just states the obvious here. She doesn't try to conceal her grief. She doesn't try to, oh, Jesus, thank you for coming. No, she says, hey, if you had been here, things would have been different. You could have done something about this. I wouldn't have to be experiencing all this grief and pain right now if you had shown up when I asked you to show up. And she knows it and he knows it. And yet here they were on a dusty road in the middle of Bethany, and Mary is crumpled at his feet, weeping. And then look at Jesus' response. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? He asked them. They told him, Lord, come and see. Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. I love that Jesus wept with her. Even though Jesus knew he was about to blow their minds and reverse this whole situation. He was about to perform the biggest miracle they had ever seen. He was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But before he did that, he didn't just rush through this tender moment of grief. He joined them in it. His heart was tender towards her. When he saw how deeply she was affected by this, it affected him too. He wept with her. He joined her in her grief. I want to tell you a tender story for me about a time that I experienced some grief. So Andy and I struggled with fertility for about 6 years. And that was a hard time for me. And there were a lot of tears cried, a lot of prayers prayed. But then one amazing day in October of 2012, I found out that I was pregnant. And you guys, I cannot even explain to you the joy that I felt in that moment. I mean, suddenly it was like birds were singing and the sky was blue and the sun was shining. And I was just so elated that finally this long-awaited dream had come true. And I imagined God up in heaven and what he must be experiencing at this time as well. Kind of like a parent on Christmas morning, and you know the present your kid's about to unwrap, and you're like more excited than they are. And I just imagine God up in heaven, like clapping his hands and laughing with joy because he could just experience my joy with me. It was an amazing moment. But then several weeks later, I started to experience some back pain, and I started to have a little bit of spotting. And I remember going to Andy and just saying, babe, I think something's wrong. And I cried myself to sleep that night. And the next morning I got up and went to the midwife. And there on her little monitor was that heartbeat. And it was so beautiful to me. And it was such a relief. And yet I was still full of anxiety. And my midwife said to me, you know, Stacie, sometimes this stuff happens and it's completely normal and the baby's gonna be fine. And you just go home and we're gonna check back in with you in a couple of days. And so I went home and man, we were praying some desperate prayers and just resting. And I came back on Friday and I was really nervous. And there on that monitor was that little heartbeat again. And I was so relieved to see that little heartbeat hanging in there. And she said to me, Stacie, this can be completely normal. You know, don't worry about it. We're just gonna monitor it. We're gonna wait and see. And you go home and get some rest. Well, the interesting thing was we had been planning a trip to San Diego, a vacation, for months. And we had 2 little boys at the time. They were 4 and 2 years old. They didn't even know I was pregnant, and we were supposed to leave on Monday morning. And so we were at a loss, like, well, what do we do here? Should we go? Should we stay? They're not gonna understand. It's gonna be heartbreaking. And so we ended up deciding to go, and we packed up the car that weekend. But by Sunday night, I could feel some cramping starting, and the spotting had picked up. And I knew what was happening. And so I cried myself to sleep that night, and I remember just thinking, like, wanting to spend these last moments with that baby. And I went in the next morning to the midwife, and the car was fully packed. The kids were in the car, and there was no heartbeat. And I know that a lot of women listening to this have experienced that pain as well. And you know the emptiness of that moment and the heartache. And so Auntie and I got in the car and we started driving to San Diego. And I just remember being in so much pain physically, but also just my heart was just completely a wreck. And the thought that kept coming through my mind was, God, how is this kind? How is this loving? You say that you are kind and that you are loving, but this feels cruel and this feels mean-spirited. Because I could have handled the pain of another month of infertility. I was used to that kind of pain. But why would you give me the gift of this child only to snatch it back away from me? God, you could have done something about this. Have you ever found yourself just beating on the chest of God and saying, God, you could have healed the cancer. You could have saved my marriage. You could have protected my child. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You know, the waters of grief are really deep. And I wish that I had more time with you today to process that with you and to share with you the whole story of what we went through and to share with you how God has redeemed this story and how Jesus was with me every single step of the way. But the picture that I want to leave with you today, the image that I want to sear into your mind is this image of Mary just crumpled at the feet of Jesus on a dusty road in Bethany. And she is pouring out her grief to him. And he is receiving it. And he is meeting her there in it. And he is comforting her. And he cried too. He didn't leave her alone in her grief. Friend, you are not alone. I don't know what kind of grief you've experienced in your life. Some of you are probably walking through some really deep waters even right now. And what I want you to know today is that you are not alone in it. What Satan would love to do is he would love to take your grief and twist it and make it turn into an anger, a bitterness towards God, to put up walls between you and God, to cause you to hold it all on the inside and isolate yourself. But the question that I want to ask you today is, what will you do with your grief? Where will you take your grief? Are you going to bottle it up? Are you going to build a wall with it? Or are you going to do what Mary did and take it straight to the feet of Jesus and just keep pouring it out? As ugly and as awful and as a cesspool as it is, just keep pouring it out and allowing him to receive it, allowing him to meet you right there in the middle of it, and allowing him to comfort you and cry with you and remind you that you are not alone in your grief. Act 2, the act of grief. How will you respond? Wow, I feel like I almost need a water break after that one. Let's go to Act 3. Act 3 is the act of surrender. This is the third and final moment that the Bible gives us a snapshot of Mary's life. And in this snapshot, Mary's not going to be sitting at the feet of Jesus to receive wisdom, and she's not going to be falling at the feet of Jesus in grief. This time she is going to be bowing at the feet of Jesus to worship him. This scenario is taking place about 1 week before Jesus goes to the cross. And actually, nobody knows that at this time. There was some tension in the air. People could feel that something was building, but there was no clarity around what was about to happen. And yet it feels like that somehow Mary gets it, that she realizes that this is a sacred moment that she's never going to get back again. And so let's enter this scene together. In verse 1, it says, 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. And can we all just stop and agree that that would be the greatest tagline to ever have in human history? I'm the guy Jesus raised from the dead. I mean, put that on your Instagram profile, right? Like, you're the winner. You got that one. So that is where Jesus is. He's at their home, and a dinner was prepared for Jesus in his honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. Now, you guys, this jar was worth about a year's wages. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars that Mary pours out at the feet of Jesus in this scene. It was the most costly thing that she had. This was a gift of gratitude. And Mary doesn't say anything in this whole passage, but as I was kind of thinking through the script that must have been running through her mind, I was thinking how she must be thinking, God, Jesus, you did everything for me. I owe you everything. You gave me back my brother from the grave. You allowed me to experience peace in a way I've never known before. I have a connection with God I didn't think was possible. I have hope for my future. You are so good. And I just want to do something. I want to give you something to show you I am grateful. You are worth it to me. Now look at how Judas responds. It says, but Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, that perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief. And since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Listen to what Jesus says. Jesus replied, leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You'll always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. He defended her devotion. He received her gift of gratitude and worship for him. And I just love Mary in this scene because she's so bold and gutsy. And she has just reached the point in her life where I don't care what you think about me. That is a good place to reach in your life. She is only interested in pleasing one person in that room. And the reality is she's not 100% sure how he's going to respond because this has never been done before. There is no precedent for this kind of behavior. And so she's walking in there, and I want you to just imagine how she must have felt walking into this group of men, having dinner, probably judging her very presence in the room. But she wanted to bring him the most costly sacrifice that she had, her very best. When I think about the idea of surrender and sacrifice, I think about a lot of different people's stories that I've heard along the way. I'm thinking specifically of this one couple that attends Echo Church, and they decided that God was calling them to sell everything and to move to a country that was neither safe nor comfortable because they felt God wanted them to go there to share the good news of Jesus with people that didn't know about him. That's an act of surrender right there. I'm thinking about a girl in our church that we had a conversation with, and she was in a relationship with someone that she really loved. And they weren't married, but she had a deep love for this person. And yet she knew that it wasn't God's best for her life. And so after a lot of prayer and a lot of pain, she decided that she was going to surrender that relationship back to God and walk away from it. And the line that she said to us that I just could never get over is she said, "Jesus, I want you more." That's what made her mind up. That's what helped her with her act of surrender. You see, there is pain in a sacrifice like that. Sometimes what God asks of us, it is going to cost you something. And there is pain in that level of surrender. But the thing with surrender is that surrender requires a wider perspective. You can't just think about this day. You have to think about that day. Because if you live a long life here on this earth, maybe you've got 80, 90 years here, but then you are going to wake up into all of eternity. And this life will feel like a blip on the screen. And you will have all of eternity to worship at the feet of Jesus. And let me tell you, friend, if you are in Christ and you wake up and you see his face, you are going to wish that you gave him more. Whatever sacrifice you made on this earth, whatever act of surrender, it will have been worth it because he is worthy, and you will wish that you had more to give. Surrender requires a wider perspective. We can't just think about how much it's costing me today. We have to think about how worthy he is on that day. It's a beautiful thing to bring a costly gift, a sacrifice that actually cost me something, and lay it at the feet of Jesus. You know, somehow in that moment, Mary got it. No one else seemed to understand. No one else appreciated the sacrifice that she was making, but they didn't need to because it wasn't for them. It was for Jesus. You know, in Act 1 and 2, Mary needed something from Jesus. In Act 1, she needed comfort. In Act 1, she needed wisdom. And in Act 2, she needed comfort. But in Act 3, she said, I'm going to bring something to him. I want to bring him my very best because he is worthy. And as you imagine this scene in your mind, just get this mental image of Mary walking into this room full of men. And everyone's kind of looking around, wondering what's about to take place. And she's holding this little jar in her hands. And her hands are probably trembling because she doesn't belong there. But she is steadfast and she is single-minded. And her eyes are locked on his because she is going to give him the most costly gift she has, out of love, out of gratitude, and out of worship. As you imagine that scene in your minds, the question I want to ask you is, what does Jesus want you to surrender? What gift of gratitude can you bring to him today? What level of sacrifice is he worth to you? Listen, I have no idea what Jesus is asking you to surrender. I have no idea how often you are giving him your yes. But in 100 different ways a day, he is asking us to surrender our lives moment by moment to him. Sometimes in small ways, sometimes in great big ways, sometimes in ways that it doesn't feel too painful, sometimes in ways that about kills us. But those acts of surrender are beautiful moments of worship where we get to say to him, Jesus, you are worth it. You know, some of you may never have taken that initial step of surrender to Jesus, to surrender your life and to surrender control and say, Jesus, I'm allowing you to come take control over my life. I acknowledge that I am a sinner and that I can't get to heaven in my own strength. I acknowledge that I can't live this life in my own strength. I've tried unsuccessfully and I need you. And if that's you today, I want to invite you to ask Jesus to come into your life, to surrender that back to him. It is your most precious gift that you can offer back to God. For the rest of us that have already made that decision, I just want you to think for a moment about what season you're in. You might be in a season that you're needing wisdom. You might be in a season that you're experiencing grief. Maybe you need hope. Maybe you're lacking in joy. And whatever it is, whatever season you find yourself in, there's a response that can lead you closer to Jesus. Every season requires a different response. And there's a response that can lead us toward Jesus or away. And so what I want to ask of you today is to be reflective. God, what do you want me to do with what's in my hands right now? How can I come and sit at your feet, fall at your feet, worship at your feet? Because you are worthy and I trust you.